Curated by 10 Dalit queer individuals, the zine explores the perplexities of the relationship between their caste identity, queerness, and the spatiality of Delhi. A zine, short for fanzine or magazine, is an often DIY subculture self-publication, usually made on paper and reproduced with a photocopier or printer. Zine creators are often motivated by a desire to share knowledge or experience with people in marginalized or otherwise less empowered communities. Born out of a storytelling and zine-making workshop, it poignantly explores Dalit queer people's affective relationship to the city of Delhi. At the heart of this pastiche of moving stories and artwork lies the unasked question: what does it mean to hold on to a city without having anything to hold on to?
The frameworks that support and reiterate casteism and homophobia are both pointedly anti-desire, among various other things. The privilege to be queer in a post-decriminalized Section 377 remains an upper caste and upper class performance, as the cost of queer performance is a life of caste blindedness, at least within contemporary Indian frameworks. With the publication of Yashika Dutt's 2019 work coming out as Dalit, a new urban aesthetics of caste was revealed to the public, which expanded a performative understanding of caste, co-opting the queer right of self-identification coming out.
That being said, while works reconciling Dalithood and queerness have since then emerged sporadically, even within our research, we were clearly able to notice a lack of scholarship and writing about the same. Queer communities and cultures within urban spaces are also largely controlled and overseen by upper caste queer people, which leads to an identification of queer aesthetics and markers with Brahminical aesthetics and markers. Our reason for the selection of this narrative was not only because of its counter-narrative to mainstream experiences of love, sex, and queerness from a Bhaujan lens, but also because of the way it invokes culturally suppressed memory and affect and its effort to counter archival violence against uneasy intersections of identity.
Water and sanitation researcher Abhijit Wagre, discussing a major blind spot in discussions about universal water justice, says that from elementary school, caste is never taught as a part of the hydrological cycle, wherein the water must flow from the pure Brahminical areas to destitute Dalit areas so as to keep afloat the caste hierarchies. As we are still plagued with questions of purity and pollution, even in our secular nation, environmental and water-related studies seem to distance themselves from discussion about these notions. Wagre points out that the principal reason for this neglect is that Indian environmental studies, including that of water, are dominated by upper caste scholars, researchers, and academics with no real lived experience with the caste system.
In the most realizable plane, water is a basic need of life, and access to it entirely affects the very quality of life and the extent of its struggles. In further conversations, the invisibilization of caste and water-related discourses makes sustainability short-sighted and only higher caste encompassing. And adding to this, that vulnerable ecological zones are predominantly inhabited by lower caste communities, which makes them more frequent victims of the slow violence against nature statistically. On a more immediate basis, it is at the cost of their health and the upkeep of their property, as the first narrative points out. The author's love for silver jewelry is offset by the same jewelry turning black due to the fumes from the nala. Their queerness and gender performance is at constant odds with their caste reality of living in dangerous proximity to the capital's aquatic dump yard.
Pink and blue are stereotypically associated with a heteronormative gender binary, with pink representing a more feminine self and blue representing the masculine. However, this colorization isn't too far off from the caste system, where one considers that it too forms a binaristic composition between the upper caste and lower caste, wherein the former is radically masculinized and intellectualized, while the latter is effeminate and inferior. The caste binary readily sustains the gender binary, thus rendering Dalit queerness as more deviant. Within queer ecosystems, the use of pink, white, and blue in unison is also employed to signal transgender or transsexual identities, and while none of the queer individuals are explicit about their labels within their narrative, the allegory of transgenderism, I believe, can also be extended to the mangled identity that most of the authors describe, wherein they are forced to perform as from a particular spatial and caste orientation, when their true identity lies elsewhere within their Dalit queer frameworks, which are often suppressed to make things easy and digestible for the sake of others.
to, the graphic narrative also strategically utilizes indicators of caste-based lived experiences, such as the nala, roads, flowing water, other bodies, etc. Several of these visual indicators depict a sense of fluidity or mobility, both being tokenistic of the queer Dalit experience. Blue has also historically been linked to the Ambedkarite movement as a symbol of Dalit resistance, primarily on account of its association with the sky, which is an interstitial space that lacks ownership, thus becoming a non-discriminatory site and a site of non-prejudice. On similar lines, the depiction of Ambedkar in a blue-collared suit attempts to challenge the preconceived notions of upper caste sartorial supremacy. It would likewise be important to know that fluidity in both gender and sexuality becomes the capital for upper caste and upper class queer individuals. An expression of Dalit queerness is not as conspicuous. Queer expressionism within urban spaces thus demands a certain social class and accessibility, which readily excludes Dalit queer individuals. Does this undermine Dalit queer fluidity altogether? While Dalit queer expressionism might not be explicit and normative, it cannot be articulated with the same queer iconography and language as upper caste and class communities. Across the Nala's visuality, then, attempts to reconcile Dalit identities with queer fluidity rather than separating it altogether.
The imagery depicted in the Zine is largely non-sequential and chaotic, with several images, icons, and symbols blending into and overriding each other. However, it would be imperative to note that the only reason as to why one might consider the imagery to be chaotic in the first place is due to our inability as privileged upper caste and upper class academics to fully comprehend the significance and nuances of these icons, since they form a part of the lived experiences that we are not a part of. Perhaps the true essence of the visuality of the Zine lies not in the presence of these symbols in isolation, but rather their confluence within the larger nexus of caste-class queerness, thus making them incomprehensible to non-Dalits while simultaneously fostering a sense of solidarity among those who resonate with these subliminal depictions. Additionally, the memoirs largely depict the influence of the traumatic memory, which cannot readily be compartmentalized into majoritarian and normative notions of linearity, precision, and order. Social dehumanization by the upper caste and cis-heteronormative political agenda gives way to the depersonalization motivated by the traumatic neurosis. The traumatic memory functions as a stream of consciousness, which is propounded by the plethora of flowing imagery. The queer Dalit experience is never stationary or calm. It's loud, vivacious, chaotic, and disorderly. The very deviance that upper castes have prescribed upon these identities are being reclaimed and weaponized through these visual metaphors.
Gaurav talks about a queer Dalit individual whose identification as queer had rendered him mobile, modern, and likable compared to his Dalit identity, which connoted a sense of backwardness and undesirability. The right kind of queer possessed access to the caste capital of language and education, which propounded their social mobility even within a larger cis-heteronormative space. What essentially occurs is that upper caste individuals are able to relinquish their caste identities and become casteless upon converting their caste capital into modern capital, while caste indicators are forcibly retained by Dalits as the sole constructor of their identities. While the narrative is indeed laden with images of motion, fluidity, transportation, space, and mobility, I find the depiction in Nalpar Sisters rather intriguing, as it essentially depicts an unconventional yet subversive choice that Dalit queer individuals too may relinquish their caste identities by solely embracing queerness and through access to education, majoritarian language, and literacy. Another aspect of mobility is observable in the panels which depict cartography, mapping, or urban planning. The city, its neighborhoods, high-key locations are condensed into miniature forms with connected roads which do not seem to end. Within this overwhelming urban imagery, there lies a sense of unmappability and brevity with spaces designed and designated for lower caste communities, appearing minuscule compared to upper caste spaces.
The general inclination from glorification to aestheticization is innately embedded within the principles of design, the very act of which reproduces, represents, and appropriates various social, cultural, and political codes under the falsification of aesthetics. According to Jacques Rancière, in his text, the politics of aesthetics, art, and politics are like forms of knowledge, construct fictions, that is to say, material rearrangements of science and images, relationships between what is seen and what is said, between what is done and what can be done. In any form of representation, there will persist a gap between what is represented, how it is represented, and the actual contextual significance of the subject. The fashioning of the aesthetics of urban Delhi comes at the cost of rendering certain spaces as unpleasant and dissonant. Anything which can otherwise be deemed as abject and unappealing are attributed to these spaces which do not form the aesthetic identity and construction of Delhi. For instance, the Nala in the initial chapter is located at Rajouri Garden and yet is named as Raghubir Nagar ka Nala, since Raghubir Nagar is a quintessential shanty town which may only be associated with a decrepit, dingy Nala.
Cis heteronormativity conflates queer touch with predation, perverseness, and predilections of the unstable. The practice of dictating who and what can be touched is also constitutive of historically marginalizing and oppressive casteist practices, to the extent which academicians such as Sarukkai have proposed that it is the upper caste who are untouchable, as they are the architects of the complex caste-based practices of purity and pollution, and not their lower caste counterparts. Touch, then, is a double monster, to borrow on Bama's idea of the triple monster, for those who are queer as well as Dalit Bhaujan, and encounters with both are scattered throughout this memoir in plain and thus painful manners. The encounter of a child's happy playtime being interrupted by an order to pick up a ball from inside the toilet. They note that they were the only Dalit person among the group of children, or a possibly sappho-romantic recollection rudely cut short by the memory of trying to scrape away one's dark skin color together, are simply some of the instances from the Zine that reveal touch as a regular weapon that constantly wears down individuals who are both queer and Dalit, and brutally distances them from friendship, love, sex, and physical affection, burdens which they carry well into their adult lives and experiences. The sensation of touch is numbed in these narratives till all it becomes is a shiver or an act of transgression.
The body often becomes a
In
site
Dalit
of
Bhaujan
violence and
narratives,
labor. A map of brutality is to be unflinchingly traced, lest memories come flooding back at unwelcome moments. In queer and disabled narratives, the body is a cage that one must hide it away, lest it disrupt normalcy, or even worse, inspire abnormality in others. The visual tract of this novel vividly helps the reader visualize the disembodiment that is described by multiple authors of the Zine. Sometimes the body is an amalgamation of scribbles, dysphoric parts, and attempts at self-love, and at other times the body is not even a body anymore. It is a picture plant that obfuscates anthropocentric lines between flora and human. It is a nucleus of shame, a scraped and abject hand, an agency-less organism that is entrapped in a fishbowl of guilt and humiliation. The queer Dalit body is politicized beyond explanation and self-justification, and the ornamentation of the body is not about beauty or even identity, but becomes a weapon of defiance. The body is scrutinized and viewed under suspicions of pollution, but is also proximally segregated time and again through accommodations, financial conditions, and the titular Nala. However, as some other authors write, the body also becomes a receptacle of education and hope, and thus a vessel of optimism of a better Delhi, a better, less queerphobic and less casteist future. Thus, the queer Dalit body is an intersection of many atrocities and prejudices, a site of many discriminations and harms, yet for many remains a radical defiance of the system through its very continued existence.
Queer and Dalit identity performances are often presented as in opposition to each other throughout the narratives of the novel. While Delhi is revealed to be a haven of pride parades, queer inclusive accommodations, and possibilities of queer romance, all of this comes at the cost of caste blindness in denying Bhahujan oppression time and time again. The upper caste intellectualism of the queer vanguards of pride is seen as insufficient models of interacting with the complexity of our narrators' cross-hatched identities. These narrators must sacrifice their safe spaces and shelters for their queerness that they find in the big city to explain caste, and thus be continuously engaged in the delicately balanced game of coveting their queer openness in a space, but also not blur their Bhahujan identity. Some of our narrators do end up having to give up one at the expense of another. A romantic relation skates them due to the part of the town they live in, or upper caste friends accost them because of always bringing up caste. Queer flatmates have to be given patient 2 years to finally digest caste realities, and after achieving their dream to study in Delhi, a narrator ends up not attending their freshers due to the fear of judgment about their outdated wardrobe. The list is broad and long, even within these few narrative experiences. The question asked is then, how does one, healthily, both in their political ventures and personal lives, manage to not continuously teeter at a dangerous edge due to two of their equally prominent identities being pit against each other by frameworks of our society? Are our attitudes against queerness and Dalits truly so deeply antagonistic, and those who identify as both must continue to live impossible lives? Or is the construction of such conscious effort to rid society of critical complexity and contemplation so that we might dismiss such intersections as simply too difficult to solve? The zine asks these pertinent questions whose very unanswerability must urge one to seek it.
A dominant narrative surrounding homosexuality within formerly colonized spaces like India is that gender diversity is a Western concept that is un-Indian, says Clara Donovan. A similar ideology can be further found within discourses of class. Jennifer Unlaw describes how the term queer in India, which is supposed to be radical and inclusive of LGBTQIA+ lives that are pushed to the margins, is being used to denote a specific elite group, creating an exclusive club. This marginalizes queer individuals with varying intersectional identities, those that are not normative within the society and the mainstream activism movements. Quoting Ashley Tellis, they explore how queer movements are increasingly termed as an elite problem. They argue that activism for queer lives in India manifests through a negotiation with Western global discourses in the English language with the purpose to ground their protests. However, the result of such is that the urban upper class developed demarcated space, along with the speech and the fusion between transnational and local discourses, has led to the normativization of particular sexualities over others, regulating behaviors and bodies, thereby creating a normative queer Indian subject that reflects the upper class socially affluent movements. In opposition to this is the subsequent creation of the deviant queer, whose identities are seen as inappropriate or disruptive, sidelining their rights within queer rights movements.
For a lot of queer individuals in a collectivistic Indian societal space, it is considered to be a given that free expression of queerness may only be possible via severance with conventional institutions of family. However, this microstructural severance for Dalit Bhaujan individuals structurally excluded from larger macro institutions might come at a higher cost than contemporary queer discourses acknowledge. This might be a function of the aforementioned queer discourses borrowed from individualistic European discourses, which do not adequately account for Dalit Bahujan experiences.
The Dalit identity is taught to be silenced due to its shamefulness by the larger casteist society and also by the Dalit households themselves. These successive identities, Shoy from Queer Beat says, increasingly distance them, who are Dalit queer individuals, from normalcy. However, at the same time, situate them in an in-between and liminal space where they are neither Dalit enough nor queer enough. So, which place do they then call home? Because in Dalit spaces, there is no room for queerness, and in queer spaces, caste is invisible. It is this aspect of questioning belongingness and by extension their existence that dissociates Dalit queer individuals from their affiliated spaces. Aside from queer identity being labeled as an upper caste concept, queer spaces are expensive and inaccessible for individuals like Shoy, who have intersectional identities which are Dalit and queer. Owing to its caste blindness formation, they have to hide their Dalit identity to belong in queer spaces. Both of these identities are then imagined to be separate and fenced, not coexisting.
On the dismissal of Dalit epistemologies, one of the authors, Arya, states that a lot of the times I feel I'm supposed to just observe and learn and take in and never give back. I'm only supposed to receive knowledge and that's what my job is. That I cannot be, in that sense, a knowledge producer, almost always a consumer, so I write underneath this. Everything has been said. Consistent with Ankit Kavade's discussion on the impossibility of Dalit studies within higher educational spaces, where Dalit subjecthood is denied, dismissed, and unacknowledged, and the subject of Dalithood is ghettoized and marginalized, a Dalit individual is not afforded intellectuality and is considered the object of knowledge rather than the subject of knowledge production. Miranda Fricker's conceptualization of epistemic injustice and the subgenre of hermeneutic injustice may explain this disregard for Dalit experience, subjectivities, and perspectives in upper caste, upper class elite spaces, the kinds which are not vehemently opposed by queer discourses. What?
Metropolitan spaces are typically partitioned into cardinal regions on larger class-based classification system. Within Delhi, South Delhi is considered to be posh and high class whilst retaining a sense of historical significance. That is precisely the formula for the modern metropolitan Indian city, an uneven amalgamate of upper caste and upper class historical remnants and upper caste and upper class modern infrastructural innovation. The project of urban infrastructural development was largely a project of disciplining the poor. Within certain spaces being designated as developed, it was inevitable that a large portion of the city would develop into what we would now term as shanty towns or slums or an urban ghetto, thus creating a layer of social, economic, and political vulnerability towards the inhabitants of such spaces. The post-partitioning urban planning of Delhi had envisioned a utopian model city that would be prosperous, hygienic, and proper. However, the construction of such required large amounts of cheap labor, and the legal geography of the region did not account for this populace whilst envisioning the city. While these policy makers were the sole architects of these shanty towns, they were also responsible for criminalizing these spaces, thus rendering its inhabitants as illegal occupants of upper caste and class spaces.
And demarcated environment of Delhi that the Dalit queer people have to navigate their equally complex identity. Fragmented queer Dalit identity is regulated through this urban speciality as well. The metro, for example, acts as an ephemeral liminality between queerness tolerant and Dalit inhabited spaces. The performance of queerness is subsumed by the reminder of their caste reality as soon as they step into the station, the neighborhood, and the nala, wherein they must relinquish free queer expression at the expense of Dalitness. It is not just their caste and gender identity that become important, however, but also their social class, educational level, occupation, space, and or place of origin, performance of said identities, and so on and so forth. Within the Zine, there were no such things as invisible imagined borders, but rather several prominent physical borders like the nala, roads, apartment wall doors, domestic spaces, public spaces, queer spaces, etc., that restricted and dictated inclusion and exclusion of Dalit queer people, some created by them to have a sense of belongingness, a home, in a city where it is impossible, and some imposed onto them.
The Nala functions as a landmark for invisible street addresses, which is to say there are no specific spatial identifiers for ghettoized areas. The everyday naming of the drain as Raghuveer Nagar Kanala rather than Rajouri Kanala shows how urban spatiality and nomenclature reproduces caste and class hierarchies within the same geographical zone of Delhi. While Rajouri Nagar is widely recognized as a posh and aspirational locality, Raghuveer Nagar is a densely populated resettlement area. The choice to attach the Nala to Raghuveer Nagar and not to Rajouri Garden is simply a malicious act of toponymic or boundary making. The same body of water may become dichotomous depending upon the populace that is associated with it. On a connotative level, the Nadi carries more capital compared to the Nala, which is considered to be polluted and menial, while the former is novel and pure.
As Henry Lefebvre argued, spaces are socially produced and spatiality is shaped by power relations as much as by physical infrastructure. By circulating the label Raghuveer Nagar Kanala, the burden of infrastructural degradation and neglect is discursively assigned to the Dalit neighborhood. The drain becomes part of the identity of the locality and by extension of its residents. At the same time, the refusal to call it Rajouri Ka Nala protects the symbolic purity of an elite space. This power to nomenclature rests within the Savarna elites who possess what Bourdieu refers to as symbolic power. A nala attached to an upper caste area would introduce associations of waste, disorder and pollution, all of which are connotations that contradict the cultivated image of Rajouri Garden.
This complicates the understanding of Foucault's heterotopia and the location of caste identity as well as the othering of caste marginalized bodies within a space. A heterotopic space typically exists within a societal space marked and set apart from the normal or normative social spaces and are both a feature of and a threat to the dominant social order. You will see that a lot of Dalit spaces become heterotopic, and all too frequently Dalits are consigned to heterotopic spaces. They become at once hypervisible and invisible. However, they do not follow the neat understanding of heterotopias of deviation, where exclusion or segregation functions to punish or hide digressions from the norm. The norm is exclusion. Caste identity is then mitigated through performative means such as alignment with urbanity, modernity, and caste blindness, but remains inescapable. Segregation precedes any perceived performed deviance. In a sense, it is similar to the treatment of disabled bodies, where deviation is considered inherent. Caste identity is thus both considered ontologically real and reinforced by performance.
For he who lives more lives than one, more deaths than one, must die, says Solanki, quoting Wilde, in their arguments about the multiple lives, fragmented identities, and the disparate experiences that Dalit Bhaujan queer individuals must live through. The author, after conversing with several Dalit Bhaujan queer people who were diagnosed with mental illnesses or neurodivergency, came to this conclusion, that their childhoods were spent with the repetitive discipline that caste identity must be undisclosed outside their household. The traumatic rapture of their repetitive marginalizing experiences leave most such individuals spending their time in agonizing dysphoria, notably through excruciating methods such as continuously subjecting their physiology to change so as not to give away their caste identity within privileged queer spaces and vice versa. Opinions, judgments, teachings, violence, and discrimination from people within and outside of their safe spaces on their identity that culminate over time dictate their warped existence and eradicate any possibility of a coherent pre-traumatic self.
Individuals, the memory
shows
of
the
the
complex
lives of
role
Dalit
of
Bhaujan
intersectionality in mental health. How having one oppressed identity causes barriers in finding, understanding, and acceptance of another oppressed identity. Furthermore, these intersecting identities aggravate the painful experience of hiding, coming out, and facing rejection. The author also mentions the creation of the vicious cycle of isolation, a distancing for protective measures against discrimination and to feel belongingness, which exacerbates their exclusion from society, leading them to not have social support, which can impact and or worsen already existing conditions and end with a hindrance in their ability to interact with people.
Certain spaces are created to include love and belongingness. However, they become instruments propagating hate. For example, queerness is tied to notions of marginality in all aspects, and yet within the context of India, these spaces that are constituted within the intention of providing belongingness, when dominated by upper caste and upper class privileged individuals, end up creating an exclusionary environment. In the urban space of Delhi, the city of contradictions, Dr. Ambedkar and Bhakti Sen Ravidas are pertinent figures in the memories of the narrators, but so is the oppressive stench of the Nala. Despite the lack of honest queer interactions within the Ambedkarite frameworks of Dalit movement, Inji and Aishwarya have consistently sought respite in the inclusionary ideological frameworks of these historical figures and thus become ancestors of a possible future queer Dalit Bhaujan epistemology.
In The Cultural Politics of Emotion, Sara Ahmed discusses the function of national shame in a cultural political economy, where the onus of acknowledgement of mistreatment of historically marginalized and minority groups oscillates between the state and the individual. This shame is hence instrumental and almost essential in national progress and nation-building endeavors. However, the urge to protect the caste-privileged individual's affective sanctity and tendency to prioritize the alleviation of individual and national guilt over the acknowledgement of historical and contemporary atrocities against Dalit Bhaujan groups has led to a pernicious caste blindness, which has subsequently led to the simultaneous invisibilization of Dalit traumatic realities and the grossly unacknowledged perpetuation of the elements that found it.
It would be remiss to not acknowledge our privileged positions within this discourse, and essential to state that these observations are a result of our limited academic engagement and exposure to queer Dalit Bhaujan experiences. This remains an open discourse, and critical contestations from within the spaces discussed are humbly welcome and appreciated. We would like to extend our sincere thanks to the authors featured in this anthology: Arya, Inji, Neeraj, Jatin, Khushmant, Bhumi, Saurabh, Aishwarya, Vasu, M, as well as the principal investigator of this project, Dr. Dhiren Borisa,
and Project Mukti for their efforts in facilitating this endeavor. We also thank Sudipta Das for their assistance in the procurement of this zine. This is
Srisha Chakraborty,
Devika Menon.
Shiny Pinto.
Sivanti Hui.
and Adrita Bhattacharya signing off, and thank you for engaging with this podcast.